The only time they succeeded in arousing him was when they burned his side with an iron for branding steers, for he had been motionless for so many hours they thought he was dead. He woke with a start, ranting in his hermetic language, with tears in his eyes. He flapped his wings a couple of times, which brought on a whirlwind of chicken dung and lunar dust, and a gale panic that did not seem to be of this world. Although many thought his reaction had been one not of rage but of pain, excuse me. From then on, they were careful not to annoy him, because the majority understood that his passivity was not that of a hero taking his ease, but that of cataclysm in response. Father Gonzaga held back the crowd's frivolity with formulas of maidservant inspiration, while awaiting the arrival of final judgment on the nature of the captive. But the mail from Rome showed no sense of urgency. They spent their time finding out that the prisoner had a navel, if his dialect had any connection with Aramaic, how many times he could fit on the head of a pin, or whether he wasn't just a Norwegian with wings. Those meager letters might have come and gone until the end of time if the providential event had not put an end to the priest's tribulations. It so happened that during those days, among so many carnival attractions, there arrived in the town a traveling show of the woman who had been changed into a spider for having disobeyed her parents. The admission to seeing her was not only less than the admission to see the angel, but people were permitted to ask her all manner of questions about her absurd state, to examine her up and down, so no one would ever doubt the truth of her horror. She was a frightful tarantula, the size of a ram, and with the head of a sad maiden. With the most heart-rending, however, was not her outlandish shape, but the sincere affliction with which she recounted the details of her misfortune. While still practically a child, she had sneaked out of her parents' house to go to a dance, while she was coming back through the woods after having danced all night without permission. A fearful thunderclap rent in the sky into, and through the crack came a lightning bolt of brimstone that changed her into a spider. Her only nourishment came from the meatballs and charitable souls chose to toss into her mouth. A spectacle like that, full of so much human truth and with such a fearful lesson, was bound to defeat, without even trying, the haughty angel who scarcely deigned to look at mortals. Besides, the few miracles attributed to the angel showed a certain mental disorder, like a blind man who didn't recover his sight but grew 3 new teeth, or a paralytic who didn't get to walk but almost won the lottery, and the leper whose sores sprouted sunflowers. Those consolation miracles were more like mocking fun. He had merely ruined the angel's reputation. When the woman had been changed into a spider, finally crushed him completely. That was how Father Gonzaga was cured forever of his insomnia, and Pelayo's courtyard went back to being empty as during the time it had rained for 3 days and crabs walked through the bedrooms. Besides, the few miracles attributed to the angel showed a certain mental disorder, like a blind man who didn't recover his sight but grew 3 new teeth, or a paralytic who didn't get to walk but almost won the lottery, and the leper whose sores sprouted sunflowers. Those consolation miracles were more like mocking fun. He had merely ruined the angel's reputation. When the woman had been changed into a spider, finally crushed him completely. That was how Father Gonzaga was cured forever of his insomnia, and Pelayo's courtyard went back to being empty as during the time it had rained for 3 days and crabs walked through the bedrooms. The owners of the house had no reason to lament. With the money they saved, they built a 2-story mansion with balconies and gardens and high netting so crabs wouldn't get in during the winter, and with iron bars on the windows so the angels wouldn't get in. Paleo also set up a rabbit warren close to town to give up his job and bailiff for good, and Isilda bought some satin pumps with high heels and many dresses of iridescent silk, the kind worn on Sunday by the most desirable women in those times. The chicken coop was the only thing that didn't receive any attention. If they washed it down with crinoline and burned tears of myrrh inside of it every so often, it was not in homage of the angel, but to drive away the dung-heap stench that still hung everywhere like a ghost, and was turning the new house into an old one. At first, when the child learned to walk, they were careful that he did not get too close to the chicken coop. But then they began to lose their fears and got used to the smell, and before the child got his second teeth, he'd gone inside the chicken coop to play. There the wires were falling apart. The angel was no less standoffish with him than with any of the other mortals, but he tolerated the most ingenuous infamies with the patience of a dog who had no illusions. They both came down with chicken pox at the same time. The doctor who took care of the child couldn't resist the temptation to listen to the angel's heart, but he found so much whistling in the heart and so many sounds in his kidneys that it seemed impossible for him to be alive. What surprised him the most, however, was the logic of his wings. They seemed so natural on a completely human organism that he couldn't understand why the other men didn't have them too. When the child began school, it had been some time since the sun and rain had caused the collapse of the chicken coop. The angel went dragging himself about here and there like a stray, dying man. They would drive him out of the bedroom with a broom, and a moment later find him in the kitchen. He seemed to be in so many places at the same time that they grew to think that he had been duplicated, that he was reproducing himself all through the house, and the exacerbated and unhinged Isilda showed that it was awful living in the hell full of angels. He could scarcely eat, and his antiquarian eyes had also become so foggy that he went about bumping into posts. All he had left were the bare cannulae of his last feathers. Leo threw the blanket over him and extended him the charity of letting him sleep in the shed, and only then did they notice that he had temperature at night. He was delirious with tongue twisters of old Norwegian. That was one of the few times they became alarmed, for they thought he was going to die, and not even a wise neighbor woman had been able to tell them what to do with dead angels. And yet he not only survived his worst winter, but seemed improved within the first sunny days. He remained motionless for several days in the farthest corner of the courtyard, where no one would see him, and in the beginning of December some large stiff feathers began to grow on his wings, the feathers of a scarecrow, which looked more like another misfortune of decrepitude. But he must have known the reason for the changes, for he was quite careful that no one should notice them, that no one should hear the sea chanties that he sometimes sang under the stars. One morning Elisinde was cutting some bunches of onions for lunch when the wind that seemed to come from the high seas blew into the kitchen. Then she went to the window and caught the angel in his first attempts at flight. They were so clumsy that his fingernails opened a furrow in the vegetable patch, and he was on the point of knocking the shed down with the ungainly flapping that slipped on the light and couldn't get a grip on the air. But he did manage to gain altitude. Elisinde set out a sigh of relief, for herself and for him, when she saw him pass over the last houses, holding himself up in some way with the risky flapping of a senile vulture. She kept watching him even when she was through cutting the onions, and she kept watching until it was no longer possible for her to see him, because then he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea.